In most neighborhoods, a lawn was just grass. In mine, it was a battlefield dressed up in suburban beige, edged with the false friendliness of trimmed hedges and HOA-approved mailboxes. The place looked calm from the street, the kind of calm that lulled realtors into using words like peaceful and well-maintained. But underneath that surface lived a set of rules enforced by people who mistook clipboards for crowns. I learned early that the grass wasn't just grass, it was a line. And lines, once crossed, had a way of daring you to do something about it. I had moved into the house at the end of a cul-de-sac because it was quiet, and because the backyard backed up to a drainage easement nobody ever used. The lawn sloped gently, a clean rectangle of green that I mowed myself every Saturday morning, slow and deliberate, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves they're in control of something. It was the one part of the property that felt truly mine. The HOA paperwork had been thick, but the promises were thin. Uniformity, property values, harmony. What they didn't advertise was the entitlement that came with the fluorescent vest and the laminated badge. The first cut across my lawn didn't register as an act of war. It was a shortcut. The HOA maintenance crew, contracted and anonymous, had decided that the quickest path between the retention pond and the row of townhomes was diagonally across my yard. Tire tracks appeared after a rain, faint at first, like ghostly fingerprints. I told myself it was an accident, a one-time thing. I filled in the ruts, reseeded, and went back to my routines. The grass grew back. The lesson did not stick. Soon the tracks became a pattern, a scar. Every Tuesday and Thursday the same compressed path emerged, a pale stripe where grass refused to stand tall. I noticed footprints, too, the heavy kind that came from boots worn by people who assumed permission was implied. The easement behind my fence had a paved access point a few houses down, but convenience, like gravity, always found the shortest route, and my lawn was the shortest route. I tried to be reasonable. I emailed the HOA office with photos attached, time-stamped and carefully framed. I described the issue in neutral terms, the way people do when they're trying not to sound angry. The response came back days later, templated and cold, thanking me for my concern and assuring me that the matter would be looked into. Nothing changed. The tracks deepened. The message was clear without being spoken. This was not a priority. The woman who chaired the HOA board lived 3 houses down. She drove a white Escalade that gleamed like a trophy and parked it in her driveway at an angle that suggested confidence, maybe even dominance. Her lawn was immaculate, edged with stones and guarded by small signs that warned against trespassing, with legal language bold enough to look official. It was impossible not to notice the contrast. My lawn was a public corridor. Hers was a sanctum. As the weeks went on, the crossing stopped being incidental and started feeling deliberate. The crew cut wider, the path expanding as if testing boundaries. On one occasion, a riding mower clipped the corner of my flower bed, snapping a young rose bush I had planted the spring before. The break was clean, efficient, like the work of someone who didn't intend to stop. I stood there afterward, looking at the damage, feeling the slow boil of indignation that comes when you realize politeness has been mistaken for permission. I added small markers at first, decorative stones, strategically placed. They were nudged aside within a day. I installed solar lights along the edge, cheap ones from the hardware store. They were knocked over, some crushed outright. Each time I documented, photographed, and sent emails that went unanswered or were met with assurances that evaporated as soon as they were read. The system was designed to absorb complaints without changing behavior, a sponge soaked in indifference. Neighbors noticed. They didn't say anything directly, but I caught the looks, the way heads turned when the tracks were fresh.
There was a shared understanding that you didn't challenge the HOA unless you were prepared to lose. Rules were enforced selectively, and everyone knew it. The board members' properties were inviolate. Everyone else existed in a gray area where enforcement was arbitrary and punishment swift. The final straw of that first phase came on a hot afternoon when I returned home early and found the crew mid-crossing. The mower cut across the lawn with the confidence of routine, leaving fresh damage in its wake. I stood on my porch and watched, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see if they would hesitate. They didn't. The mower didn't slow. The line was crossed again, and something in me settled into place, heavy and irreversible. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't send an email. I didn't take photos. I went inside and closed the door and let the air conditioning hum. In the quiet, I thought about the nature of rules and how they were enforced. I thought about how some people only respected boundaries when those boundaries had teeth. The HOA had made it clear that my polite requests were invisible. They had also made it clear whose lawn mattered and whose didn't. That night, I walked the length of my yard with a measuring tape, noting distances, angles, the way the ground sloped. I wasn't planning anything yet, not consciously. I told myself it was just curiosity, just understanding my own property better. But curiosity has a way of opening doors you didn't know were there. I stood at the corner where the tracks were deepest and imagined a future where the line was no longer easy to cross. The next morning, the Escalade gleamed in the sun as always, untouched and unchallenged. My lawn bore the marks of neglect and entitlement. The contrast was no longer just unfair, it was instructive. In this neighborhood, respect wasn't given, it was enforced. And if the HOA had taught me anything, it was that enforcement didn't have to be subtle to be effective. As I put away the measuring tape and looked out over the damaged grass, I understood that this wasn't about lawn care anymore. It was about control, about who got to decide what mattered. The HOA had drawn its line across my property without asking. In time, I would draw one of my own, and when that happened, the neighborhood would finally pay attention. The grass, still bent and pale, seemed to wait.
Once you start paying attention to how an HOA really operates, it becomes impossible to ignore the imbalance. The rules exist, thick and wordy, printed on glossy paper and posted online behind password-protected portals. But enforcement is a living thing, flexible and selective, bending toward whoever holds the clipboard. I learned that lesson not from a meeting or a warning letter, but from watching how quickly the system moved when someone else stepped out of line. The week after I stopped emailing about my lawn, a neighbor across the street received a violation notice for leaving his trash bins out past noon. The letter was taped to his door in a bright orange sleeve, impossible to miss. A fine was threatened if the issue wasn't corrected within 24 hours. I watched him read it, shoulders slumping, and then hurried to comply. The bins were gone within minutes. The HOA could move fast when it wanted to. My lawn, meanwhile, continued to serve as a shortcut. The maintenance crew didn't even bother pretending anymore. They crossed in broad daylight, sometimes twice a day, leaving behind footprints, tire marks, and the unmistakable impression that they knew no one would stop them. It wasn't just convenience, it was precedent. My property had been quietly reclassified as communal space without my consent. I finally received a response from the HOA office weeks after my last message. It was brief and dismissive, framed as clarification rather than apology. The email explained that the HOA retained access rights for maintenance purposes and that occasional crossing of private lawns was considered acceptable if it facilitated efficient operations. There was no mention of compensation, restoration, or even notice. Efficiency apparently trumped ownership. The language bothered me more than the damage. Occasional,
acceptable, words chosen to soften the reality that my property was being used because it was easier than following the rules everyone else had to follow. The easement access point down the street remained unused, a longer walk that nobody wanted to take. My lawn was closer. That was the entire justification. I replied, pointing out that the crossing was neither occasional nor minor, attaching updated photos that showed the widening path and dead grass. I asked, again, for a solution. The response never came. Instead, something else arrived. A violation notice. It cited my lawn. According to the letter, my grass was no longer uniform and had developed bare patches inconsistent with community standards. I was given 10 days to remedy the issue or face a fine. The irony was so sharp it almost felt intentional. The HOA had destroyed my lawn and then threatened to punish me for the result. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. I attended the next HOA meeting, not to argue, but to observe. The room was half full, populated by familiar faces and practiced smiles. The chair sat at the front, elevated slightly, a physical reminder of hierarchy. The chairwoman was there, composed and confident, her Escalade surely parked outside like a silent endorsement of her authority. As the meeting progressed, I listened to complaints about parking, noise, paint colors. Each issue was addressed with rehearsed empathy and vague promises. When it came time for open discussion, I raised my hand. I didn't speak emotionally. I didn't accuse. I simply described what was happening to my lawn and asked how it aligned with the rules everyone else was expected to follow. The response was polite and empty. The HOA acknowledged my concern and reiterated the importance of cooperation for the good of the community. They suggested I take preventative measures if I was worried about damage. The implication was clear. The burden was mine. Protect your property better or accept the consequences. After the meeting, I noticed how quickly people left. No one lingered. No one made eye contact. Challenging the HOA was contagious in the worst way. It made people nervous. I walked home with a stack of papers in a growing sense that reason had no leverage here. The maintenance crew returned the next morning. This time, they brought heavier equipment. The ground was dry and dust kicked up as the tires rolled over the same path they'd carved over weeks. I watched from my window, coffee untouched, as the damage spread. They weren't careless, they were efficient. The path was now wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass side by side. My lawn had officially become infrastructure. I placed temporary fencing along the edge that afternoon, the kind meant for garden beds. It lasted less than a day. When I came home from work, sections were snapped, others pushed aside. There was no attempt to repair or replace them. The message was blunt and unmistakable. That evening, another email arrived from the HOA. It referenced my unauthorized barriers and warned that installing obstructions could interfere with maintenance operations. I was instructed to remove them immediately or face penalties. There was no acknowledgement why the barriers had been placed in the first place. Cause and effect had been severed entirely. I complied, not because I agreed, but because I was learning. Every interaction revealed more about how the HOA functioned, where its blind spots were, and how it responded to resistance. They weren't concerned with fairness, they were concerned with precedent. If I succeeded in pushing back, others might try. That couldn't be allowed. As the days passed, the situation drew attention. Neighbors whispered. Some expressed sympathy in private, careful to keep their voices low and their distance measured. No one offered help. Everyone understood the risk. The HOA thrived on isolation. The violation deadline for my lawn approached. I received reminders. The bare patches, they said, needed to be reseeded. I laughed at that. Reseeding would be pointless as long as the crossing continued. It was like being told to repaint a wall while someone was actively punching holes through it. That's when the idea stopped being abstract. Standing at the edge of my yard one evening, looking at the path that shouldn't exist, I realized that passive resistance had only made me more vulnerable. The HOA responded to obstacles by removing them. They responded to complaints by ignoring them. They responded to compliance by escalating demands. The only thing they hadn't encountered was consequence. I didn't know what form that consequence would take yet. I only knew that whatever I did couldn't rely on their approval or cooperation. The rules had proven themselves meaningless unless backed by power. And power, in this neighborhood, respected only one thing: disruption. As the sun set behind the houses and the Escalade down the street caught the last light, gleaming and untouched, I understood that the next phase wouldn't involve emails or meetings. It would involve action, something undeniable, something that couldn't be quietly dismissed or folded into a templated response. The path across my lawn was finished being drawn. Now it was time to draw a different kind of line.
The moment you stop asking for permission, everything looks different. The yard didn't feel like a loss anymore. It felt like a lesson already paid for. I stopped seeing the damage as something to fix and started seeing it as data. The width of the tracks, the timing of the crossings, the weight of the equipment. Patterns emerged once I stopped hoping they'd go away on their own. The HOA maintenance crew was predictable to the minute. Tuesdays and Thursdays, mid-morning, with occasional bonus appearances if there had been heavy rain. They favored the same diagonal route every time, shaving seconds off their schedule at the expense of my property. They didn't vary their path because they didn't need to. No one had ever made them. I began documenting again, but not for the HOA. I filmed from inside my house, angles chosen carefully, timestamps visible. I measured the depth of the ruts and noted how long it took for the dust to settle after a pass. This wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about understanding the mechanics of intrusion. The violation notice for my lawn expired, and the fine appeared on my account without ceremony. No appeal process worth mentioning, just a number added to my balance, a quiet reminder of who the system favored. I paid it immediately, not out of surrender, but because I didn't want distractions. The less leverage they thought they had, the better. The Escalade remained pristine. Every morning it sat in the driveway like a monument to selective enforcement. No tire marks, no footprints, no maintenance crew ever dared to cross that lawn, even though it would have been an even shorter route. Respect, it turned out, was contagious only in one direction. I tried one more preventative measure, subtle enough to look compliant. I added landscaping. Not fences or barriers, but features. Large decorative rocks, heavy enough that moving them would require effort. I positioned them along the worst of the path, spaced just close enough to make crossing inconvenient. For 2 days, the tracks stopped short of the rocks. For 2 days, the lawn rested. On the 3rd day, the rocks were gone. Not moved aside, gone, removed entirely, as if they had never existed. I found them stacked neatly near the drainage easement, out of sight and out of mind. The crossing resumed immediately, wider than before, as if to punish the attempt. The message wasn't just no, it was never again. That was when the emails escalated. The HOA informed me that altering the landscape without prior approval was a violation. The rocks, they said, posed a safety hazard and interfered with maintenance access. I was warned that further attempts to obstruct would result in additional fines. There was no mention of where the rocks had been taken or who had moved them. Responsibility was a one-way street. I stopped responding entirely. Silence unsettles bureaucracies more than anger ever could. Without my replies, they had no script to follow. Notices still came, but they grew vaguer, more aggressive in tone, less anchored to specifics. It was clear they wanted engagement. I refused to give it. Instead, I focused on the yard. I walked it daily, sometimes multiple times, studying how the ground responded to weight and weather. The soil composition varied more than I'd realized, softer near the center where water pooled, harder toward the edges. The slope created a natural funnel, guiding movement along the same line every time. It wasn't just convenience that kept them crossing there. The land itself encouraged it. I began to modify the terrain in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Minor grading adjustments, slight changes in elevation that looked natural but altered how vehicles moved. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the street, just enough to test reactions. The first time a mower slowed crossing my lawn, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. The second time, it stalled briefly, wheels spinning before regaining traction. The third time, the crew adjusted their path slightly, widening the track again to compensate. They were adapting, unconsciously acknowledging resistance even as they ignored its cause. The HOA noticed. Another notice arrived, citing uneven ground and potential hazards. I was instructed to restore the lawn to its original grade. The irony had lost its edge by then. It was just noise. I complied on paper, submitting a vague plan for reseeding and leveling that bought me time. Time is the only thing I needed. Neighbors began to pay closer attention. The crossing had become impossible to ignore, and so had my response. Some avoided me entirely. Others watched from behind curtains, curiosity battling fear. The HOA had trained everyone well. Intervention was discouraged. Observation was safe. One afternoon, I returned home to find fresh damage, worse than usual. Deep gouges cut through the center of the yard, the result of something heavier than the usual equipment. Whatever crossed wasn't supposed to be there. The ground was torn open, roots exposed, the scar unmistakable. That night, I checked the HOA calendar. A major landscaping project had been scheduled for the common areas. Larger machinery, tighter deadlines, increased pressure to cut corners. My lawn, already established as a shortcut, had been pressed into heavier service without a second thought. The realization was clarifying. They weren't going to stop, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't see a reason to. Every attempt at prevention had been treated as provocation. Every complaint had been reframed as non-compliance. The HOA wasn't reacting to my actions, it was enforcing a hierarchy. So I stopped trying to block the crossing. Instead, I embraced it. I cleared debris from the path, smoothing the edges just enough to encourage consistent use. I stopped reseeding entirely. I let the grass die back, exposing more soil. The crossing became cleaner, more defined, more reliable. To an outside observer, it looked like surrender. To anyone paying close attention, it looked like preparation. I began spending time in the garage. The HOA had no authority there, no bylaws governing what I built or stored, as long as it wasn't visible from the street. I reorganized, cleared space, and took inventory of tools I hadn't used in years. Lumber, hardware, old mechanical parts, things I'd kept because they might be useful someday. That day had arrived. The design didn't come to me all at once. It evolved piece by piece, informed by the yard, the slope, the patterns of movement. I sketched in a notebook, refining angles and forces, calculating trajectories based on distance and elevation. It wasn't about destruction, it was about inevitability. The HOA understood rules. It understood fines and notices and selective enforcement. What the HOA didn't understand was physics. As the weeks passed, the crossing became routine again, the crew confident in its entitlement. The Escalade remained pristine. Every morning it sat in the driveway like a monument to selective enforcement. No tire marks, no footprints, no maintenance crew ever dared to cross that lawn, even though it would have been an even shorter route. Respect, it turned out, was contagious only in one direction. I tried one more preventative measure, subtle enough to look compliant. I added landscaping, not fences or barriers, but features. Large decorative rocks, heavy enough that moving them would require effort. I positioned them along the worst of the path, spaced just close enough to make crossing inconvenient. For 2 days, the track stopped short of the rocks. For 2 days, the lawn rested. On the third day, the rocks were gone. Not moved aside, gone, removed entirely, as if they had never existed. I found them stacked neatly near the drainage easement, out of sight and out of mind. The crossing resumed immediately, wider than before, as if to punish the attempt. The message wasn't just no, it was never again.
That was when the emails escalated. The HOA informed me that altering the landscape without prior approval was a violation. The rocks, they said, posed a safety hazard and interfered with maintenance access. I was warned that further attempts to obstruct would result in additional fines. There was no mention of where the rocks had been taken or who had moved them. Responsibility was a one-way street. I stopped responding entirely. Silence unsettles bureaucracies more than anger ever could. Without my replies, they had no script to follow. Notices still came, but they grew vaguer, more aggressive in tone, less anchored to specifics. It was clear they wanted engagement. I refused to give it. Instead, I focused on the yard. I walked it daily, sometimes multiple times, studying how the ground responded to weight and weather. The soil composition varied more than I'd realized, softer near the center where water pooled, harder toward the edges. The slope created a natural funnel, guiding movement along the same line every time. It wasn't just convenience that kept them crossing there. The land itself encouraged it. I began to modify the terrain in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Minor grading adjustments, slight changes in elevation that looked natural but altered how vehicles moved. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the street, just enough to test reactions. The first time a mower slowed crossing my lawn, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. The second time, it stalled briefly, wheels spinning before regaining traction. The third time, the crew adjusted their path slightly, widening the track again to compensate. They were adapting, unconsciously acknowledging resistance, even as they ignored its cause. The HOA noticed. Another notice arrived, citing uneven.
There is a particular kind of calm that settles in once a decision is made. Not relief, not excitement, but a quiet certainty that whatever happens next is no longer theoretical. That calm followed me through the final days before everything changed. From the outside, nothing looked different. The lawn was still ruined, the HOA trucks still crossed it without hesitation. The Escalade still sat in its driveway, polished and untouched, a symbol of how untouchable some people believed themselves to be. Inside the garage, however, something had taken shape. I kept the door closed at all times, not because I was hiding anything illegal, but because secrecy had become a habit. The HOA had trained me well in that regard. I worked slowly, deliberately, assembling and adjusting, testing components in isolation. Nothing I did made noise loud enough to draw attention. Nothing I did violated any written rule. It was simply a structure, inert and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had spent months policing grass height and trash bins, issuing fines over cosmetic details, while completely ignoring the fact that their own behavior had driven me here. They believed compliance equaled control. They had never considered what happened when someone stopped trying to comply. The crossing continued like clockwork. On the morning everything changed, the maintenance crew arrived earlier than usual. I noticed because I was already awake, watching from the window with the detached focus of someone observing a process rather than an injustice. The truck rolled in, followed by heavier equipment than I'd seen before. The path across my lawn absorbed the weight without resistance. Weeks of repeated use had packed the soil into something closer to a road than a yard. They crossed twice that morning. The second pass was slower, the driver adjusting to the deeper ruts, but still confident. Why wouldn't he be? Nothing had ever happened as a result of this shortcut. It was safe. It was sanctioned by silence. It was routine. By early afternoon, the neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm. Cars came and went, lawns were watered, deliveries arrived. The Escalade sat gleaming, angled just so, its position unchanged from any other day. It was parked close enough to the street to be visible from my yard, close enough to be impossible to ignore. I didn't rush. I waited for the right moment, the kind of moment you only recognize once it's already arrived.
The street was quiet. No pedestrians, no children playing. The HOA office was closed for lunch. Conditions aligned, not by luck, but by patience. When I finally stepped into the yard, it felt less like trespassing and more like reclaiming something. I walked the length of the path slowly, confirming what I already knew. The ground was firm, the angle was consistent, the sight lines were clear. Everything I had allowed to happen had led here. What followed happened quickly, but not chaotically. There was motion, sudden and undeniable, cutting through the stillness of the afternoon, a single, decisive event that transformed months of quiet frustration into an irreversible outcome. The force traveled exactly where it was always going to travel, obeying rules far older and more reliable than any HOA bylaw. The sound was what drew attention first. It wasn't explosive, but it was sharp and final, the unmistakable noise of something expensive meeting something immovable. The Escalade shuddered on impact, its pristine surface violated in a way no warning letter could ever repair. Glass shattered, metal bent, the kind of damage that couldn't be buffed out or explained away. For a moment, there was silence. Then the neighborhood reacted. Doors opened, curtains shifted. People stepped onto porches drawn by the disruption they'd been conditioned to fear. The Escalade sat wounded in the driveway, unrecognizable from the symbol it had been just minutes earlier. The damage was dramatic, impossible to misinterpret as an accident caused by weather or chance. I stood in my yard, hands empty, posture relaxed. I didn't run. I didn't hide. There was nothing to hide from. What had happened was the natural conclusion of a pattern everyone had witnessed but chosen not to question. The shortcut, the entitlement, the selective enforcement, all of it had finally collided with consequence. The HOA chairwoman emerged from her house moments later. Her reaction unfolded in stages: confusion first, then disbelief, then something sharper and less controlled. She circled the vehicle, inspecting the damage, her composure cracking as reality set in. This wasn't a scratch. This wasn't vandalism that could be blamed on teenagers or bad luck. This was targeted, precise, and devastating. Phones came out. Calls were made. Someone called the HOA office, someone else called the police. The maintenance crew, still working nearby, froze mid-task, suddenly aware that the shortcut they'd enjoyed might not be as consequence-free as they had believed. The path across my lawn, so familiar and ignored for months, suddenly looked different to everyone seeing it now. I was asked questions. I answered them calmly, factually, without embellishment. I explained the history of the lawn, the repeated crossings, the ignored complaints, the fines issued for damage I hadn't caused. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I let the timeline speak for itself. The police listened. They looked at the yard, they looked at the tracks, they looked at the vehicle. They asked about easements and permissions and prior documentation. For the first time since this all began, the burden of explanation shifted away from me. The HOA chairwoman tried to assert authority. She referenced rules, responsibilities, expectations. But authority is fragile when it's built on assumption instead of legitimacy. The officers asked questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Why was private property being used as a roadway? Where was the documentation granting access? Why were prior complaints unresolved? The answers didn't come easily. By the time the scene began to disperse, the neighborhood felt different. Not quieter, but heavier, like everyone had just realized something fundamental had changed. The Escalade was towed away, its absence leaving a gap that felt symbolic as much as physical. The maintenance crew packed up early that day. They didn't cross my lawn again. That evening, I stood at the edge of the yard, looking at the path that had started all of this. It was still there, etched into the ground, but it no longer felt permanent. It felt like a relic, evidence of a mistake that had finally been acknowledged. The HOA would respond, I knew that. There would be meetings, letters, attempts to reassert control. But something irreversible had happened. The illusion of invulnerability had shattered, along with the glass and metal of that Escalade. For the first time since I'd moved in, the balance had shifted. And as the sun set over a neighborhood still processing what it had witnessed, it was clear that the final chapter wouldn't be about damage, it would be about fallout.
The days after the incident moved slowly, as if the neighborhood itself was trying to decide how it felt about what had happened. The path across my lawn remained untouched, not because it had been repaired, but because no one dared use it anymore. Absence became the loudest statement of all. Where entitlement once rolled freely, hesitation now lingered. The HOA acted quickly, but not decisively. Emergency notices went out to residents about an ongoing situation and temporary changes to maintenance routing. The language was careful, stripped of blame and accountability. No one mentioned my lawn. No one mentioned the Escalade by name. The event was treated like an unfortunate anomaly rather than the predictable result of months of disregard. Still, the silence where the shortcut used to be spoke volumes. The maintenance crew adjusted their routes immediately. They began using the official access point down the street, the one that had existed all along. It added time to their schedule, required more effort, and inconvenienced them in exactly the ways my property had spared them before. Not once did they complain. Not once did they test the boundary again. The lesson had landed. The HOA chairwoman stopped parking in her driveway. For several days, the space where the Escalade used to sit remained empty, an unintentional monument to misplaced confidence. When a replacement vehicle eventually appeared, it was parked deeper into the driveway, farther from the street, less visible. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Symbols, once broken, rarely get replaced with the same enthusiasm. I received a certified letter from the HOA the following week. It was longer than any communication they had sent before, filled with formal language and cautious phrasing. The violations against my account were under review. The fine related to my lawn was suspended pending further assessment. They acknowledged that maintenance procedures had unintentionally impacted my property and proposed a remediation plan at their expense. There was no apology. There didn't need to be. I didn't respond immediately. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I wasn't operating on their timeline. I let the letter sit on the counter while I walked the yard, now quiet and undisturbed. The soil, compacted and scarred, would take time to recover, but recovery was finally possible. That alone felt like a victory. Neighbors began speaking to me again. Not openly at first, casual comments during walks, careful observations about how things had changed lately. Some offered quiet thanks, framed as jokes or hypotheticals. Others kept their distance, still wary of association. The HOA had done its job well over the years. Fear lingered even after authority faltered. At the next HOA meeting, attendance was higher than usual. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The agenda included new guidelines for maintenance access, stricter adherence to easement boundaries, and a review process for resident complaints. The chairwoman read from prepared notes, her tone measured, her posture less assured than before. Authority, once cracked, never quite sits the same. The rules hadn't changed. Their application had. Work crews were now accompanied by supervisors. Routes were planned and documented. Private property was avoided with almost comical precision. The HOA had discovered a renewed respect for boundaries, not because they'd suddenly embraced fairness, but because they'd learned the cost of ignoring it. My lawn was eventually repaired. New soil was brought in. The ground was leveled. Grass was reseeded and fenced off temporarily, this time with official signage and approval.
The process was slow, bureaucratic, and thoroughly documented. Every step required confirmation. Every decision was cautious. The same system that once bulldozed over my concerns now tiptoed around them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Life in the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The visible tension faded, replaced by something quieter and more durable. People followed the rules not just because they were written, but because they understood they weren't immune to consequence. The HOA continued to exist, but its aura of inevitability had diminished. It was no longer an untouchable force. It was an organization that could be challenged, if not openly, then effectively. I never rebuilt the lawn exactly as it had been. I kept subtle reminders of what had happened. Landscaping choices that discouraged shortcuts without announcing their purpose, natural curves instead of straight lines. The yard became less efficient to cross, less inviting to entitlement, without needing to be defended again. The garage returned to just being a garage. Whatever had been built there was dismantled and stored away, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, not of anger, but of resolve. I didn't feel proud of what happened. I felt finished. There's a difference. The Escalade never came back. Occasionally, I'd see the chairwoman's replacement vehicle pass by, slower than before, eyes forward, posture careful. We never spoke. There was nothing left to say. The balance was corrected, not through conversation or compromise, but through a moment that forced everyone to acknowledge what had been ignored. In the end, the HOA didn't fall apart. It adapted, and so did the neighborhood. The grass grew back thicker than before, resilient in a way it hadn't needed to be previously. When I mowed it now, the lines stayed straight and uninterrupted by tires or footprints that didn't belong there. The lawn was once again just grass. But the lesson beneath it remained. Boundaries don't enforce themselves, and shortcuts taken long enough always lead somewhere.